Okay, I think we're going to get started here. Clap once if you want a beer. Clap twice if you want 2 beers. This is excellent. It's all coming together. All right. Joe Bleidinger has the beer. Just see Joe. He's in the back. If you clap twice, you get 2 beers. If you clap once, you get 1. All right. Thank you all for being here and having a great morning session. It was really great to see the level of interaction and discourse. So thanks. Let everybody grab their chocolate dessert and then settle in. Got everybody from the outside? Great. My name is Tony Lewis, for those of you whom I haven't met. I'm the director of the Donald K. Foundation. Really, my first order of business is both to thank you for being here, but to thank my staff for putting this together, Carmelita and Matt especially. Along with that, I want to thank C-Trust, Carrie, and Ethan and their crew, and Scott Benson for helping make the funding of this possible from Gates, and then all of our great consultant friends and folks from Public Impact to Evergreen. So thank you all for being here and for making this session really valuable. Before I forget, y'all have one of these or several of these on your table. And this is just we've tried to put a bunch of resources together. It's on our website. So a bunch of those reports that have been referenced are on the Donald K. website. So just go there, find those, download them, tweet it, do something with it. What else? Let's see. I want to just talk for a minute before we go into a panel with Scott and Bruce. When I think back to when we first started doing the blended learning summits, and some of you were there 4 years ago, I think, when we started this, 3-4 years ago. and at that point in time, if you remember, we were trying to tell people what blended learning was. We were trying to show a few examples. We had those great guys from Woodland Park who were doing the flipped classroom, and the guy was riding his bike up the Pikes Peak Highway and holding a bag of potato chips. The other guy was filming him, watching the bag grow bigger and bigger, and talking about this physics of what's happening with the air pressure in that bag. And then sending that home with kids to watch at night. And then coming back during the day and saying, wow, let's talk about it. Let's do your homework in class. Let's send you with a lecture at home. And that rocked people's world, right? It was just like, oh my God, I never thought you could send the lecture home and work with kids in the classroom on the stuff they're having trouble with. And that to me was this great inspiration point of like, let's start spreading the word about how impactful blended learning can be. And then let's start looking at other proof points. Let's us as a foundation help fund some proof points. Let's look nationally at proof points. And let's get that discussion, that rich discussion going, and let's get it deeper and deeper. And so each year we've seen just an incredible movement in Colorado with blended learning and with schools and classrooms and even districts moving that direction. At the same time, here we are like 3 or 4 years later, and all of us, and I think, on the national level, Scott and Eric and I and others have said, why isn't it moving faster? Like, if this is so incredible, if it's changing student performance so quickly and so well, and it's changing staffing, and it's changing the nature of instruction, why isn't it moving faster than it is? I don't think it's for lack of money. I don't think it's for lack of interest. I don't even think it's for lack of results that you see. And that is, in essence, the central question that I want both Scott and Bruce to talk about. Scott at the national level, Bruce from his experience in several school districts. If this is so impactful and so powerful, what is holding it back from accelerating faster? And I hope you guys will probe them. We'll give them each a couple of minutes to talk, and then just engage in some questions and answers, some Q&A. And if it's a question that's better answered from somebody else in the audience, that's fine too. We'll move it around. But to me, that's the central question, certainly as a funder. How do we move this important work forward faster. So that's what I'm going to ask those guys to talk about. I want to make note of one thing that Scott said that really struck me. All those insight definitions of schools and or classrooms. Are you blended? Are you flex? Are you, there were so many, like I can't keep them straight anymore. And what that says to me is when you start with several discrete models, and over time people iterate and innovate, and they create more models. At some point in time, you have this continuum of work and not necessarily a continuum of models. And the driving question, I think, is what do I need to do with my students to ensure their learning, and how does technology play a role in that? How can I learn from these models that I see? How can I take those learnings and apply it to my situation, my context? And then it doesn't matter anymore if it's a flex model or a classroom rotation, or it just matters that you're being super thoughtful about how you're working with your group of students. Are you accessing teachers nationally or internationally, getting the best people in front of your students? How are you using technology to ensure small, instructional, groupings of kids? And so I think we're going to see over time, just like Amy mentioned, we're not going to call it blended learning at some point. It's just going to be learning. And we're not going to call it flex model or lab model or classroom rotation model. We're going to call it learning. And we won't be gathering everybody together to talk about, now, what is that learning like? Hopefully that will just infuse through the system. That's certainly my hope. I think we're on that path. I want these guys to help us figure out how to accelerate that path. But I think that's what we're trying to do. So just a couple words on both Scott and Bruce. Scott Ellis is the Executive Director, President, CEO, all the above, of the Learning Accelerator, and its mission is to transform K-12 education by accelerating the implementation of high-quality, blended learning in districts across the United States. So perfectly positioned to address this question I've thrown out there at a national level. Bruce Messenger is currently the Boulder Valley School District Superintendent. What I love about Bruce, just having not met him before, but having lived in Boulder for a long time, he started in Greeley as superintendent. He went to Helena, Montana as superintendent. He came back and is now superintendent of Boulder, Colorado. And if you can imagine two more disparate places than Greeley and Boulder to be superintendent in, I can't think of almost any other juxtaposition. So when Bruce was in Montana, he was also on the governing board of directors for the Montana Digital Academy. And so he brings a depth of experience as a superintendent in 3 different districts in the West and on that blended learning, kind of task. So with that, let me ask you each to say a few words, and then let's open it up for Q&A.
Great. If you could hand me the little clicker, I'll show a couple slides.
Absolutely. And please welcome both Scott and Bruce.
Thanks very much. And so although I live in Silicon Valley now, I grew up in Fort Collins and went to high school at Poudre. Was just talking to Bruce, and we have a new superintendent, so I'm very excited about that. And when I told people I was coming here, they said, is the superintendent from Poudre R1 School District going to be there? And I guess not, but hopefully this person will start in a couple months, and then we're going to make sure that blended learning starts happening up in Fort Collins as well. So as Tony said, I run the Learning Accelerator, and the reason our organization exists is very much to answer this question, which is how do we make this happen faster? Our organization is founded on the premise that we think blended learning has transformative potential for American education for all the reasons that we've all seen, and we're nervous. And the reason we're nervous is that blended learning is complex, and it's tough to implement blended learning. There are a lot of things you've got to do, and I'll talk in a couple seconds about some of that. And as more and more schools and districts around the country start turning to the marketplace to say, great, who can help us do all the things that we need to do? Who can help us implement our broadband and train our teachers? How do we figure out how to pay for this stuff? The answer is there's almost nobody there. We've definitely got startups. We've got some very exciting starts. We've got some nonprofits here and there that are trying to help. And we're seeing more and more examples of individual classrooms, charter schools, et cetera. But over the next several years, when Boston and Austin and DC and all of these districts around the country start doing this, because eventually we want our goals for all 50 million kids in America to benefit from this. When they all start turning and saying, great, we want to roll out blended learning across our districts, they'll swamp the ecosystem. And so our goal really is to say, how do we accelerate this by doing two things? The first is we've got to build up that ecosystem. So we want to mobilize significant capital, $100 million over the next 5 years, to make grants to a whole range of organizations that will help districts and schools implement. And so that's the first part of our goal. And the second part of our goal is to create a small number of robust proof points of implementation at scale at the district level. Because I had a call a couple weeks ago from Boston where they said, we have done a lot of work in this space. We rallied folks for our Race to the Top application. We were very close to winning. We want to move forward. What should we do? And you're running the Learning Accelerator. We were told we should talk to you. And what I wanted to say was, let's go to our website. Here are 3 to 5 examples of what it looks like when you fully rolled it out and when you've got implementation fully for blended learning at a district level. Here's the path to get there. So they could say, oh, I got it. I know where I'm trying to go. I can see how I can customize this for my context. Now let me turn back to the ecosystem and work with these partners to make it happen. And so our goal over the next 5 years is to build up that ecosystem and to create those proof points so that we'll have then a marketplace where we've got inspired educational leaders and we've got an ecosystem to help them. And so I think when I think about why isn't this happening faster, I think it really is about how do we build up that ecosystem and how do we establish the proof points, and we're getting more and more of them. But I think when I think about this, we have lots of the pieces and they're kind of getting there, and we're seeing some of the software that is starting to work, and we're seeing some examples of what mastery-based report cards look like, and there are legends of professional development for teachers in blended learning context. So these pieces are coming together. We need to make it a lot easier so that as the models continue to get defined and as people in very challenging contexts say, I want to make that transition, it's easier for them to make the jump. A couple other messages I want to leave, and I think there's some frameworks that have been helpful for us in our work at the national level, and I think as you all, we've asked you to put on the school hat today and really focus on changing it at school. For a second, I'd like you to step back and put your national hat on and say, so what is what we kind of call the bigger picture for blended learning overall, and then for implementation. The first point is this is a national movement. And so this, Ethan and Carrie talked a little bit about the C-Trust is working in communities across the country, having sessions like this to help people come together, see what's happening so far in blended learning and what's possible for the future. But I'm visiting schools all across the country. A lot of the conversations I've had today are conversations I've been having with folks in Chicago and other communities around the country. So the first thing to know is it is a national movement. And even if there are times when you get frustrated or focused on the challenges in this space, I would say feel good that there are colleagues of yours all around the country who are working on solving the same problems. The second piece, and let's see how this works. Here we go. Is I think just to step back for a second to think about sort of the bigger picture. And as I think about it, we've been spending a lot of time today in this yellow implementation space, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. That's where our focus is. How do we help schools and districts that are not able to do blended learning today be able to do it in the future? But stepping back as we see what all is happening, at the very top, there's a kind of a public opinion, a national conversation about education, about technology and education, about blended learning, and people who are working very aggressively on that to help people understand what is blended learning, how do we continue to define it. Below that, there's a second piece, which is the policy piece, the actual legislation at both the state level and the federal level that either helps enable and accelerate the implementation of blended learning and the use of technology, or can inhibit it. And a lot of times I think about this as there are places where we need to play offense and places where we should play defense just to make sure that we have the policies that we need. A third is what we call state implementation activity. So not actual legislation, but other activities that states do to help enable blended learning, to bring together funders, practitioners, and districts to do sort of mini race to the tops that we're seeing now to help identify attractive models and implement those. Next is the implementation level like we've been talking about, and we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And then the last is the daily teaching and learning, right? Where the rubber really hits the road. We've got schools, we've got classrooms, we've got teachers, and we've got kids coming every day learning in a different way. And so when I think about what's happening at the national level in terms of blended learning, this is the full landscape that I think about. And again, our focus is really on this implementation piece, but really being aware of the connections with the other parts. And I think sometimes as you guys are doing your work, being mindful of implications for policy and also kind of the national dialogue and just thinking about it in this way can be helpful. And then the last thing I'll say, is a framework that's helpful for us specifically when we think about implementation. And I think, I've been talking with Terry, and I believe that you'll all, if you haven't seen it already, there's a blended learning implementation guide that we've put together. It's just version 1.0, but to try and capture our thinking about what are the things that schools and districts need to do well repeatedly in order to implement blended learning well. And I think when we talk about what does it take to make this happen faster, a lot of it's about being aware of the full value chain. What are the things that we need to do, and make sure we've got the strategy up front. What is our 3-year plan for this? Starting with kids and kids' learning goals, and then what role does blended learning play? And then what model do we want to select? And then a lot of the conversation we've had today about model and staffing and so forth. And then infrastructure. Are all of your schools wired? Do you have the broadband you need so that all these kids can be watching video at the same time? And what happens if that goes down? So how do we make sure every school in the country gets that? And working through this kind of a value chain in a very systemic way, both so that up front you know the journey that you're going to be going on and that all of our colleagues across the country will be going on, and then piece by piece working through to make sure that we've got the whole thing in place so that we can make blended learning happen. So I think as we think about from the national level how to help make it happen faster, it is really starting to happen. There's more demand than I think anybody expected at this stage. And I think it's things like this, sort of systematically, repeatedly working through it, sharing the lessons will really help make it happen faster.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Good afternoon. So I'm going to just build on those comments because in many ways as a school district superintendent, all of that applies. And just it's a matter of scale and scope as I look at it. So a little bit about my background so that when we get to the questions that might help you direct questions, or again, we might direct them back if we don't know the answers to them, which I've been told that's okay. I'm a superintendent who actually started out as a classroom teacher, served as a principal, and so I've been in this business quite a while. And so I've had a chance, like many in this room, to watch this work evolve over time. The work I'll just briefly talk about the work that I was involved with in Montana as a superintendent. We realized a need for both blended and online learning. It's a rural state, a large geographic area. People are pretty spread out. Makes Colorado look really populous. We, as a group of districts and associations, tried to build this from the ground up and ultimately created models that had some success, but we couldn't keep the momentum. We couldn't keep the finances working. But we learned a lot of really valuable lessons. We learned what things we wouldn't ever do again, and those things that we absolutely should keep doing, but we didn't have the capacity to do that. But we had done enough work and had done enough homework in the state that we were ready to go to the legislature and got a state solution. And so they authorized funding for us to create what became known as the Montana Digital Academy, and really pulled from all corners of the state, large and small districts. And I served on the chair of that governing board. We hired a director, and we went to work. It was a very interesting model. That's a whole presentation on itself, but there aren't a lot of good state solutions around this. I would say that Montana has one of them, not just because I was involved with it, although I do have some bias, but truly it's thriving and growing rapidly. And there's a huge investment both from the local level and the state level, which is part of the reason I think it works. So that's work I did for the last decade before coming to Boulder Valley. Boulder Valley School District, we have 30,000 students, 55 schools, and serve 9 communities, including the city of Boulder. So lots of things going on. It's a pretty informed community. It's a connected community. They have pretty high expectations of their schools, which is a good thing. So the work that I see going on right now, and to build on this notion of a blended learning environment, again, I think it is a lot, both from the national perspective, but then state and local, is about building capacity. So capacity means lots of things. One is access through fiber, access through hardware, handheld devices. One of our high schools has gone to a one-on-one environment, so we're rapidly building that capacity. And so some of it's a resource issue for sure, but the other is, how we use our resources. If we spend $2 million on textbooks, which we just did in our district, so then are there other ways to use those resources in the future? And do we have the capacity to deliver that instruction in different ways? So those are questions I think every district has to work through. The other thing that I think is important is to professional development, clearly, to be able to think in terms of that delivery. But the other part I think that's important is to create cells within systems where it works, and so that peers can see peer-to-peer, see it happening, and not have to, I mean, go into workshops are great, we're here, that's great, but the reality is change doesn't happen here. Ideas for change can happen in places like this, but really for a teacher or a principal to begin to move on this, I think they have to actually see it working, and it has to be over time by folks whom they know and they trust, because then they think, oh, that's like me. It's not like someplace I don't know about or don't understand. It's like down the hall from me. We saw that success with online learning, and I think we can see that built with blended learning as well. So that's an important element, I think, of building capacity. The other is, I think it's really important within school systems that educators can look around and say, is this okay? I mean, is it okay if we migrate away from traditional? Okay with our elected board? Is it okay with our community? Is it okay with our leadership in the building? And is it okay with my peers and the kids that I serve? And I don't think we should just assume that that's an automatic yes, that people believe it's okay. I would say one of the products or the outcomes of the high accountability movement in this country and in this state is a sense of, I'm just going to use the word fear, a sense of fear of failure by educators in classrooms. So we always thought, and it was true, Montana was a long ways from Washington, D.C., so we gave ourselves permission to do things that weren't necessarily in line with the federal government. You would expect that from Montana, I suppose. And we were kind of proud of that. And we just figured by the time they found us and got to us, there'd be a new president or something different would have changed. And so we weren't as afraid of this. I mean, the kids performed really well. We did great things, but we weren't so obsessed with it. But I think sometimes we get so obsessed with this accountability piece that people are afraid, really afraid, to try something notably different because they're afraid their state test scores might dip or something might happen. And I have gone through a little bit of a adjustment shock, might be the better word. Coming back to Colorado, I was here and then I came back. Obsessed is the word I would use. And I just said, so can we relax a little bit? Because if we're going to try some different things, we can't be so obsessed about a test score. And so not everybody agrees with me on that. So we'll work through that. But our district just went through a visioning process, our board did, with our communities. We had over 100 people who gathered for a couple of days in the fall, community parents. There were some strong messages that came out of that. So these are folks whose kids are in our system, and it's a high-performing system. But they said, get some balance. Find some balance on the work you do with our kids. Engage them. Make it meaningful for them. Give them some other opportunities. And we'd like you to personalize the learning more. Well, as I think about this discussion today, and I think about those expectations. So now those words, those values have now been incorporated into our draft vision and goals for the district. So then how do we deliver on that as a school system? I think if we really engage our parents and others around us, we might find that the accountability initiative may not be coming from them as much as others. And so in our responsibilities to deliver education for the students who are in our system, whose parents live in our communities. And so I'll stop there. I could go on, but I won't. But I think that if we don't give ourselves permission to try some different things as a profession, then we're going to sit and watch those outside of our work, outside of our public education system, deliver that, and others will go there. And we will have been caught in the accountability structure trap, and the only innovation occurs outside of our system. So I think we have to break that mold and give ourselves permission to do that innovation and not have to get an innovation approval. We can just do it. And if we need to get a variance, we should just do that. And so one of the things that I found interesting last fall, I was visiting with some Colorado Department of Education senior administrators. They said, no one ever goes to the state board and asks for variances. They really never do anything to get out of the containment of the rules. And I thought, well, golly, we'll get started with that right away. We'll ask permission, I guess. So I think that, again, it's changing that culture and creating capacity within so that we can work through that. So the personalization for the learners and also looking at the unique needs. As we look at having success with all students, from early readers to our graduates and beyond, I really do think we have to find ways to personalize the learning experience for students. And I think the blended learning environment is a way, it's not the only way, it's a way to build that capacity to do that. So maybe I'll stop at that point, and that's all right. And then we'll see what questions there might be from folks in the audience.
Well, we've agreed that this is going to be a competency-based progression, so we're not going to just sit up here until the time elapses. We will answer questions you have, and if there are not more questions, then we'll move on to the next session. So.
Scott, you talked about building up an ecosystem to help this. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? What you mean by that?
Sure. So I think our starting point is, what are the barriers that we think prevent districts and schools around the country from implementing blended learning faster? And then what can we do to eliminate those barriers? And again, the core of our organization is the hypothesis that there being some kind of neutral nonprofit in the middle of all this craziness, whose goal is to help kind of align and move things forward in a structured way, would be helpful. And so our starting point is actually this value chain up here. Because when we think about scale, it's really, what does district after district and school after school across the country have to do to implement blended learning effectively? And we look at this and say, great, what are the areas where there are barriers for schools? And then what are the things the free market won't solve on its own? So for example, I think the software space is an example of a place where you've got a lot of for-profits, you've got a lot of startups. It's really unclear how helpful a nonprofit would be in that part of the marketplace, even with the best of intentions. On the other hand, there are areas that we think that the free market won't solve. So the first of these, kind of moving across here, right? So the first is broadband. How do we make sure every school in the country gets sufficient broadband to do blended learning? And so we're funding an organization called Education Superhighway. They're nonprofit based in San Francisco, and their goal is to make sure every school gets 100 megabit broadband on the path to 1 gig. And so that would be an example where we say, let's fund and help build up an organization whose goal is to make sure that happens for every school around the country. A second, kind of moving across, would be pool purchasing of hardware. How do we help districts leverage their buying power to save money? So that rather than every district buying separately, we aggregate that so we can get discounts. And then the other areas we're thinking about are professional development. How do we figure out how to provide the kind of training that's going to be needed? Helping to cultivate the consultants. We think districts, even the future state, will need help, especially in the strategy part and the implementation part. They'll need consultants. How do we help make sure there are the kind of consultants we need around the country, and how do we make that work cheaper for districts so it's affordable? And the last is financing. How do we think about how to help pay for that? And so those are 5 areas as we work across this value chain that we think these are structural barriers that we'd like to work to eliminate. And the way to do that is to really find organizations that are doing it that we can fund, or if we can't, then we want to find entrepreneurs to start new organizations to fill the gaps. So that's how we think about it.
I liked what you said about consultants until the part about how they could work more cheaply for districts.
It's about the kids.
Scott, you said earlier something about the state role. And I'm curious what you think that is generally. And Bruce, I'm interested in what you think it might be in Colorado.
So I think the short answer is I don't know yet, but we're starting to figure it out. So what's starting to happen is, first, an example from Rhode Island from last year where they held a convening, bringing together a number of districts. They brought out experts in blended learning, software providers and others. They brought out Michael Horn from Insight to help districts understand what this meant, what might be possible, and then they were able to leverage some funding and then had their own kind of mini race to the top type competition to say, let's have districts make proposals for what kind of models they want to implement, and then let's fund some of those proposals. And so I think that's an example of a state playing a kind of convening role to help, first of all, raise awareness and then bring together some dollars and help drive, frankly, acceleration of implementation, or at least of experimentation. And we're starting to see things like that happening in more states. So a structured process to help bring together districts, raise awareness, bring together some of the experts to help define the possibilities, and then start funding promising models. And so I think that's one aspect of it. I think there's definitely a policy role, and I think that the Learning Accelerator is really not engaged in that. We're certainly connected with other organizations like INACOL and others that are focusing on policy. But I think a lot of what we're trying to look at now is I'm having conversations with New Jersey and Illinois, and then again the folks in Rhode Island, and now more states that are saying, we see this happening. can we do things at the state level to help our districts do this more, and what does that look like? And so I think I've actually just in the process of hiring a person, and her job is going to be to sort of flesh out what this looks like. But I think there's a lot of potential here. I don't know what it is, but since the state level is so important in American education, I think it seems natural to say to really drive this, it's a good place to start.
So I think, again, just to probably build on those comments, I think states should get out of the regulation mode as much, and they can help convene folks to bring people together, both school districts and experts in state and experts from out of state, to help create a culture, an environment that nurtures this work, and so to help cause that to happen in our state. We have a lot of rural areas. We have people who are far apart, but even those of us who are close together don't meet as much as we should to convene and work on these issues. So I think state departments or state can have a role in that. And I also think incentive resources to get things going, to create models, to encourage that. I'm not a big fan of making that all about competition. I think the competition should be about readiness to take that next step. But if you're 2 steps behind, that resource would still be there when you're ready to do it, and that you don't have to be first in line always. But if you are first in line, that's great. You can open the door for others, and we can learn and go back and build that over time. I think there's a valuable role for states in that. And again, I reflect on my experience in Montana. Truly, we would not have been able to pull off what we did without the state. And it wasn't like the state superintendent doing it. It was about the state as a whole. So we had the legislature involved, we had the State Department involved, we had state leaders involved from large and small districts, really working to convene and to create models that could be then replicated and built on over time. So that's what I think a state role can be with that. I actually think we could accelerate all of this a lot more if there was constructive, thoughtful leadership in state solutions around this. Maybe this is some of what goes with the Rocky Mountain West and the independence that we all have. I think we resist that, but maybe it's the regulatory piece of state control that we resist. Maybe the notion of people collaborating and convening and building off that, there could be some great advantage. My experience has been there are more similarities and commonalities between large and small districts, urban, suburban, and rural districts than we think there are. Again, in Montana, that's just experience you had to have up there, is that we really had way more in common than we thought we did. But once we went to work on it, we found we had a lot in common, and we may deliver it in different ways that it meets different needs, but we had some very common interests. So I think there's a big role in state solutions around this.
Bruce, I have a question for you about from a district perspective. As a district leader, as we talk more about wanting to create learning environments that break down barriers of walls and clocks and calendars and really personalize. You said you were hearing that people wanted a more personalized learning experience. How do we take a place like Boulder, which is still pretty much relying on you choose school A or school B or school C to go to creating a more open learning environment where kids have access to choices that might be at a more granular level and extend beyond a school building? If you've thought about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So, and this is probably true in a lot of school districts in Colorado because of our choice legislation. 40% of our students attend a school other than their home school in our school district. So we have 6 charters, we have focus schools, we have neighborhood schools, so kids move around a lot. So that's the school-to-school choice. I think to take it to that next level, so one of our school, Nederland, the community is in our school district, and so sometimes students feel like the only way they can get a comprehensive curriculum like Fairview, which is 2,200 students, Fairview High School, that they have to physically transfer to Fairview to have that experience. And well, the reality is today, they might have done that 15 years ago, but today, they absolutely don't have to do that. They, as we know, can actually take courses from Fairview and stay in Nederland. And so, so that notion of using technology and through multiple means to create shared learning experiences across space and across time, because in many ways we're still very contained within a traditional school year, traditional school buildings, school walls. So I think that's, again, that's building capacity, in my opinion, that you don't have to change high schools to get that course that's offered at Monarch High School. You can stay at Boulder High and still do that, or at Netherland. So I think that this is actually the exact topic that would help foster that in schools. Or you can stay in Otis or Yuma and take, you know, that advanced placement course at Fairview if you want to. So across districts to do that. You don't have to physically go to the building or change your enrollment to have that experience. Again, I think we just need to create models and encourage that to happen. It's absolutely, as we know, it's all there. We just have to create. Again, I do think that's where state solutions can be helpful, because they create an environment that fosters that. The one thing that we did in Montana before we created a state solution is we helped pass laws that kept districts from poaching on other districts, because we watched what happened in Colorado and learned from that experience, and said that we aren't going to have that happen there. And so there was no incentive for us to recruit kids out of other districts. They stayed in their home district, they enrolled there, the per pupil funding went there, but they could still take courses out of our high schools or vice versa. So again, that's where I think the state involvement can be helpful to create incentives for cooperation as opposed to incentives for competition that get in the way.
I had to step out for a minute. Scott, I'm not sure if you've talked at all about some of the leading school districts in the nation, about, you know, who's out in front, who's doing this work, who can we look at and learn from?
And that may be a question for Scott Benson for later. I mean, I think part of our challenge is we certainly are seeing some examples. So I think there are a number of districts in Pennsylvania that are working with education elements and are implementing a lot of the rotation model there. Actually, what's exciting for me is to start meeting with some of the vendors who are helping those districts. So I had lunch with one of them, and he sort of laid out in front of me, here's the presentation I give to the BOCE, right, or to the sort of at the local education level. Here's the presentation I give to the district. Here's what the budget looks like. Here's the template that I use to create for them. Here's the presentation I give to the teachers. So I'm starting to see some of that happening, which I think is very exciting. I don't have great examples yet of districts that are doing it, that are out in front that we can copy. And I think this is something where people like Michael Horn and others, they're the ones who are really keeping tabs on what's happening in districts. But I don't have, again, when Boston called, I didn't say, great, here, talk to the superintendent. So I'm still looking for them. And I'm seeing some, and again, I think a lot of what we're seeing now are the examples of the charters and people who are experimenting more at the school level. But I'm still getting to a point where I can say, great, I want to be able to leverage a great district aggregated purchasing policy for how we're going to set our decision about one-to-one or not with devices, and how do you roll that out across a district. I haven't got it yet, and so I don't have a great answer for you.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask Bruce, as the superintendent. One of the things that we as a foundation have been trying to figure out is where's the best unit of change and the best place to do innovative work. And that's actually led us pretty far away from districts and much closer to the classroom. And I'm curious about, like, will we see districts? Like, should districts set policy? Should districts decide what the ratio of laptops or devices are? Or should the district set the environment by which innovation takes place at a classroom or maybe at a school level? So I'd love your thoughts about that.
So I think the one word you used, and Scott used it earlier, about the ecosystems or the environment, I do think creating an environment that fosters innovation and change from the boardroom to the superintendent's office is important. But I actually think the change, the building, especially initially, the nucleus, really does need to occur closest to students, where, and I'd mentioned earlier in my comments that notion about teachers doing it next door or down the hall. So, I mean, I think you have to have the right leadership at the building for that to even to occur, or at least for it to be encouraged. So I don't want to negate that, but I don't think it has to be the principal who absolutely is leading it. I think they need to, again, help create that environment where it's encouraged, and that they'll help champion it and help celebrate it and help perpetuate it in the building. So those roles are real important, the teacher and the principal. But if you have a superintendent who doesn't get it or has other things they're worried about and can't help build that culture, then that's a problem. And I also think the board is also, because if things don't go quite right and people choose to exercise their freedom of speech and come to a board meeting and hammer on the school board or the superintendent, and they don't have the understanding or have helped create an environment that's encouraging and welcoming. I mean, I've watched boards be able to be appropriately responsive and understanding and just keep on going despite the criticism, but that doesn't just happen. I mean, it has to be nurtured. And so I don't think it happens from the boardroom. I don't think it happens from the superintendent's office. I really do believe it happens in the school unit, the classroom unit. But I think that thread has to pull through. Whether it's a larger system or a smaller one, it's just a matter of scale. But I think the issues are many times the same because, I mean, when you create change, you're going to run into resistance. And you need to have an environment that encourages the change and also resists some of the pushback that goes on with it. But I think all levels are important in it.
Maybe let me add one thing, because I actually get asked this question a lot about, hey, so what is the unit of change? I think at some level with a lot of the things that we're talking about here, we don't need to choose yet. I mean, once we get to a point where everybody's got broadband and everybody's got devices and we've got the models out there, then we can have the conversation about what's the most effective way to actually get everybody to do it. But at the moment, I'd say the more we can enable broadband for districts where they're going to do it more at the district level, great, they've got the potential for that. And for places where it's the individual teacher or, frankly, the individual student at home who's doing this, if they've got all access to the internet with the speed they need, to all the different software, et cetera, it's going to make the market move faster because there's a bigger marketplace for the software vendors, and so they're going to develop their apps faster. And I think it's also going to sort of soften the ground for the future. So I envision a world where eventually the superintendents come in and say, hey, guys, we're going to go in this direction. And all the teachers say, well, about time you caught up to us because we're all doing that. And I think that would be the kind of world that I'd really like to see. And I think we can actually have our cake and eat it too by enabling everyone. And so I don't think we need to choose. And then if we take a long-term view, I want to reach all 50 million kids. How do we make that happen? I think that's the key question for us.
I didn't see you up front.
Short arms. So I think obviously all of us in this room are engaged in this work and want to see more technology in the classroom. So I just wonder if you two can speak to what do you do to engage the schools and the districts that have the infrastructure and the hardware but are not thinking about it or using it?
I have an answer. So the answer that I give, and again, this is from the Learning Accelerator standpoint, what I basically say is I'm not interested in convincing anyone to do blended learning right now. We're doing this because we believe it has transformational potential, and I'm also very excited about getting more and more of the results and the evidence about student learning so we can make a stronger and stronger case, which we can then use to convince a skeptical audience and say, no, here really is why you want to do it. And then back to the different layers of the landscape. As that happens more, there will be more people hearing about it from the press, people talking to other parents, hearing about other districts who are doing it that will create pressure for change. But I think the starting point for us is we want to make it easier for the people who want to do it. And so how do we help figure out the ecosystem so that when people say, I want to do this, they have a plan, and then they have an ecosystem, and now it works. I know that's kind of an easy answer for me to give because I've got 14,000 school districts out there. So if one district doesn't want to do it, I say, great, here's my card. Call me if you change your mind, and we'll be happy to help you. And we're running a lot to folks in communities who say, well, that's nice for you, but I live in Chicago, and I really want Chicago to do this, so how do I convince them? And I think part of what we're starting to do is to put together thoughts about what are people doing in terms of having good conversations with unions, having conversations with districts, et cetera. And so I think I'm actually being very careful about encouraging or pushing people to do it yet. But I think as the evidence gets stronger, then I think what we'll start being able to do more and more is make a really strong evidence-based case, which is not just look how cool this looks and look what the future of education looks like, but increasingly we have really demonstrable evidence that this is much better and therefore really worth it. And I think we'll be able to convince even some of the hardiest skeptics over time.
And I think if we have great models or examples in our state, I really do believe that it isn't about forcing people. I really do think folks attract themselves to great ideas. So I think those cells, those pockets of success, and keep the door open at all time. I think that network works pretty well. And I think that, maybe they just don't want to and they just won't go there. But I think sometimes it's a lack of understanding of knowledge, maybe desire, but eventually, success will spread pretty quickly. I think if they can, again, I think it's in all those demographics from rural to urban to suburban. It's helpful to see models in all those different places because if they don't see themselves there. But if it's a district that looks like them or a school that looks like them, they say, maybe we should look again at that. Maybe that has potential here. Maybe we should go visit and learn more about that. So, I think I don't think it has to be regulated. I really do think success will build success with this over time if we nurture the right environment for it.
You're all very quiet.
Just what strikes me is that we're always envisioning this question of incorporating blended learning into brick and mortar schools. Not equally, but there is a population of full-time online schools that are moving towards blended learning, which is the opposite direction in terms of thinking about actually having a location and using facilities versus being full-time online. And I'm just curious if either of you have had any experience in thinking about how to take a full-time online, maybe multi-district school to a blended learning place.
So I haven't thought a lot about that, but I will now think about that. But I will relate an experience that I think might connect to that some. Both in the district I left and now the one that I'm in, we've created brick and mortar on-site locations for homeschool families to come in and participate. And I think it is the model that will do what you're describing, is that this population of bringing folks who do full-time homeschool and maybe full-time online into a physical environment, because there is value to that for activities specifically for that purpose. Then how do you then bridge that blended or online the two? I think it invites getting away from the notion that either I'm a student who goes to that school or I'm a student that doesn't go to a school. I think there is a middle ground, and I think that's part of that, changing that culture where we really get away. And this is where the state can help us, because there's still a lot of rules and laws that are about sitting in a seat and counting hours and all of those things. So that's where we can help work on state solutions around creating more flexibility. But if you take a family who's educating their children in a non-traditional environment, be it homeschooling or online, they've already stepped out of the box. They've already given up that whole custodial structural thing. And so then when you engage them and say, well, is there something in the middle that we'd like to do together? And they're a little skeptical. My experience is they're a little skeptical at first. That can lead to some pretty interesting meetings. But that once you get the door open and have the conversation and have some success, then you begin to say, and what if we added this option? So there are states, Washington State, for example, as I've looked at some of their models where they case manage students as opposed to, and that's kind of that blending. I think there are some nice models around the country where that goes on. And I think online, blended, homeschool, in-school, all of those are just part of a continuum. And again, we just need to give ourselves permission to create environments. Talk about learning centers versus schoolhouses. So they might come in for some blended, they might come in for some face-to-face social, they might come in for activities, they might come in to take algebra the traditional way. But it isn't as restrictive, and that goes back to, I think, the earlier question about choice. Not just choice between schools or choice to a course to a school, but really choice of coming together to learn in an environment that's conducive to different modes of learning.
So let me just ask you a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a political question, so you can punt if you want.
Probably not.
Districts tend not to want to fractionalize per pupil revenue, right?
Yeah.
Because then a parent may say, like, I don't want your algebra class at Fairview. I want an algebra class offered by this vendor.
Yeah.
Where would you stand on that as a superintendent?
So as soon as I leave here, I'm going to the Capitol to watch the Senate Ed Committee try to work through a school finance legislation that we've been working on
just for fun,
months.
probably.
So we spent a lot of hours on that this week. But one of the things that is in this bill that we're working on around school finance on this point is that it's kind of buried under all the other controversial pieces. It's actually a piece that we like, is that I wouldn't a high school student would be a high school student, just like a first grader, in that if they only are on Boulder High's campus 3 periods a day, Boulder Public Schools still gets one full revenue. And then we work with the student and the family to create other learning. So it could be going to a college campus, but we don't break up the pieces. So the money flows to the district, and the districts help create, especially in this case for high school age students, where they could put together a program that may not be just sitting in a class for 6 periods of a day. for the whole year. So I think again, that's an example of a piece of legislation around funding, because money drives a lot of this. About maybe we don't worry about breaking the pieces of money apart. Maybe the money goes to the school district, and then the school district works with the student and the families to broker opportunities, and that's that center of learning piece. Maybe they go to CU half day, and so we've got other laws that touch this, but I think that notion of the money is with the student in the district, and then you create lots of options. So, but yeah, I think it's, we're all interested in where the resources go, because it's how we build systems that work over time. So.
Well, I guess the only thing I was going to say was back on your previous question about the virtual schools. So in the Michael Horn reading, when he talks about disruptive innovation and what that looks like, and a way to make it happen is you start in areas of non-consumption. So you start where you don't have a strong established competitor, because then as you're innovating and trying to figure out how to make this thing work, the hurdle for it to be successful is not as high, right? Instead of competing against a fully established, defined system that's at this level of quality and you're only down here, you actually are competing where there's nothing else there. And then over time, you get better and better and better, and then you're able to fundamentally disrupt the whole system. And so I think thinking about an idea where you say we've got people who've already decided to go to virtual schools, and so now they're looking for an opportunity to get the blended piece in, well, there's no other offering out there. And so if you can create something that works, even if it's not perfect, but you've got a solution, you're trying to figure it out, that gives an attractive opportunity to someone. Now you start building a market for that, and it gives you a chance to improve it, and maybe that's a way to help the change happen faster. So I kind of going back to your initial question at the beginning of the session, how do we make it happen faster? I think it's things like that that can be structural ways of approaching the innovation that could actually help all this stuff get figured out faster.
And so,
I'm assuming
Bruce,
someone else is watching the time, by the way. We're just stuck here talking. So.
You briefly alluded to talking about accountability and the test scores and how that needs to be backed off. And I agree with you completely that with change comes resistance. And so I'm curious, with all of the new things that are happening, SB 191, and I think teachers are really resistant to that change because they know that they're 50% of their evaluation is riding on these tests, and we know that. Does that test really truly evaluate student growth and achievement? Does it really evaluate the teacher's skills? How do you see blended learning being able to play a role in this, and possibly those changes taking place at the state level? And will the assessments continue to play that vital role in accountability for teachers, or will this blended learning give teachers an opportunity to be accountable in different ways other than just test scores?
So my biggest regret is that I didn't move back to Colorado before Senate Bill 191 was introduced, so I could have worked on it. So because I'm enjoying working on school finance, but I would have really loved that bill. But I didn't. So the way we're approaching it in our district is really looking at demonstrated student success beyond a state measure. And so, and if we at some point have to go before the State Board of Education and talk about what we're doing, then we're going to do that. But we're really, in our district, building this model around Senate Bill 191 that really is doing it the right way. And so I think blended learning and other learning modalities and approaches can be equally as successful on state tests and other things. But I think we will shortchange our students if we only rely on those measures like state tests to evaluate the success of students. I think it will force us back into that, keep us in that box if we're in that box. So I really think as educators in this state, we have to push that hard and say there are lots of ways to demonstrate student success, and we'll be able to show that through teacher evaluation, whether I'm a band instructor or a first grade teacher. There are lots of ways we can show, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't be accountable, we shouldn't be responsible, it doesn't mean we don't want kids to learn, but it just means don't put us in that box. There are lots of ways to do that, and I think there's flexibility in 191, for example, that districts can do that, and if collectively we need to come together to help rewrite the regs on that, then I think we should do that. I just think we'll shortchange our students in the long run if we don't do that. And that's partly about different ways of learning, including blended learning, but it's also just being really effective professional educators and knowing our kids and knowing how they learn. So I just think we need to keep that full and rich.
Bruce, you talked about your role with Montana Digital Academy, and that's really been a very successful program in terms of allowing students across Montana to self-blend with individual online courses. We've never really figured that out here in Colorado. We've had, of course, Colorado Online Learning, but it's never reached that level of support and scale. And I'm curious if you could comment on a couple of things. One is there some difference between Montana and Colorado that allowed that approach to really work and take off in Montana? And do you think that sort of program at the kind of scale that you had in Montana would be valuable here?
So, yeah, I do think there are differences, notable differences between the political environment and the public schools in Montana versus Colorado. For as close as we are, proximity in the country, you wouldn't expect that. So there was a really aggressive work of which I personally participated in, is to control things so that we created environments so that we could build it. So Montana is one of 8 states that there are no charter schools. There is no competition. The public schools are the best show in town, and they take pride in that, and they're fighting hard right now to stop charter schools in Montana right now. I'm not judging that. I'm just saying there is a different environment up there. And so they also didn't want districts taking kids from each other. They really wanted to create a state solution. So it was a different environment, and they didn't just sit and not do anything. They took advantage of that environment to create a system. So I think there's some things that are unique about that state that have allowed that digital academy to thrive. But so Kurt and I have talked a lot about this. So, it's kind of hard after you started down the path to go back and pretend that didn't happen and start over again. But I do think there are some things that we could do as a state that would nurture that kind of an environment that would create a state solution that really could create some efficiencies and opportunities. So I think some of it is applicable, but there are some things that are pretty unique about that environment. The other thing that is a little unique about that environment is that the collaboration between school districts and state associations is a little bit, we wouldn't recognize it here. They work hand in hand, the State School Boards Association, State Teachers Association, the school administrators, the public. It's a very tight collaborative relationship on problem solving, from an online digital academy to state funding for schools. So I'm getting used to this environment. I remember it when I was here before. There's still collaboration, but they are way down the path on that. So I do think there's some environmental things that are a bit unique. But some of the remote isolation and rural nature of Montana contribute to that need, but that exists in this state as well. You get out of the Denver metro Front Range area, there's that same sense of rural and isolation from our mountain communities and our farm communities that we had in Montana as well. So I think the need is as great here as it was there. Or is there?
You've got time for one more question.
We can hear you.
Hello? In a shameless attempt to try and attract money to less affluent districts, I'll preface it with that. I'm pretty well versed in the whole idea of disruptive innovations. But one of the things I've also been considering, and I think I've been hearing about it since the 80s, is this looming crisis with science and math teachers. And I look at one of our high schools in Greeley, Colorado, and we're going to lose 5 math teachers for a variety of reasons. I think with our budget shortfalls and our inability to pay teachers as much as some of our surrounding districts, I think that there's going to be a motivation for a lot of less affluent districts that don't have mill levy overrides to look at different models to expand the influence of highly impactful teachers. And so I'm reaching out for the less affluent communities to think about, some of these private donors, if you would like to come in and develop some models to think about. I think that some of our very traditional brick and mortar schools would be very open to that kind of innovation, because I really, CU's graduating 11 pre-service math teachers, and we need 5 of them. So I just really see that coming. So just your thoughts on that, maybe from the panel and anybody else.
When I think about the disruptive innovation piece, so much of it's about barriers to change, and it's also about the relevant competition versus existing solutions. And I think that one way of doing it is to work in areas of non-consumption. I think there's another way to deal with that, which is to have leaders who say, we know it's experimental, we know it's innovative, and we want to do it for a variety of reasons, right? We need to do it or we want to do it. I think as we're working with schools and districts around the country, we're seeing people who want to do blended learning in largely two contexts. One is they're in a crisis, and they've got to find a way to save their kids and to give them the best possible learning outcomes they can in the environment they're living in. And the others are who are actually doing well, but saying, we want to make this happen. And I think that again, as you say, less affluent, rural, but the key for me is willing leaders and staffs and teams who say, we want to make this happen. I think that right there creates the same kind of conditions for potential disruptive innovation. The one thing I think it's important to be mindful of, and we'll talk about this a little bit this afternoon, is I think, again, in those two situations, the more districts are in the crisis aspect or schools are in the crisis case, where, yes, this is a great motivator for change, the challenge is it can make the change management or the implementation harder, because even if you have participants who either are willing or have been made willing, that creates a lot of other strain on the system, and now trying to introduce a whole bunch of change in that context can be tricky. And so I think it's important to be mindful of that, but I think otherwise, I think it is an opportunity to say, this creates the conditions which are very similar to the others we talked about for disruptive innovation.
The only thing I would add is that there are a number of things we are challenged by in this state, and funding of our schools is a huge one. And there are a lot of symptoms, some of what you just described, that are creating different opportunities and experiences for young people across this state because of a need to put adequate resources in. But having said, so we need to keep working on that. Having said that, I think that, again, technology has the ability for us to share staff and expertise across districts. And so let's just assume the salaries are as good as Greeley as they were in Boulder, and so people don't move for that reason, but they really want to work there because they care about their community, they want to work in that school. But how do we share expertise across districts, and then the rural districts around Greeley or in the Eastern Plains? How do we do that so people don't have to move just to survive, to get a good salary? I mean, that's important. But then in addition, one of the experiences we had in Montana was that we had incredibly good teachers in really isolated parts of the state, and they couldn't employ them full time because they just didn't have enough kids. And so through this digital academy, they were able to work full time educating kids in Missoula and Billings. And so because we were able to do it through technology, that's some of that choice piece. That's not, you don't have to move, you can do it across. So I think that, again, that's one of the benefits of working on state solutions, and I know we're working on some of those right now in the state. But I think that spreading that wealth, the wealth of expertise of teachers across districts, is something we can do better over time. And I think that will help us all feel better about working in the communities we're in, because that's where we raised our families, or that's just where we want to live, and we don't feel like we have to move to get to something better.
And I feel like I should respond, since you did the shameless ask, which I really appreciate, actually. We always say in the funding community, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I think the challenge is, as a funder, we can't support every school nor every district in that movement towards blended learning, right? So we have to pick and choose. And I think where and this is just us, where we pick and choose is to look at schools or to look at districts that can show a path for others. And it may not be the exact same path, but it's close enough path you can say, well, they did it this way. We can get some resources, but we've learned enough from them. We don't need as many resources as they did when they first started. The other is we try to fund things like, and I'll point out Kurt and Judy, the eLink consortium, right? That says, hey, if districts are willing to work together and to join this consortium, and then at a reduced price, they can gain access to content, high quality content, to high quality professional development, then our funding of eLink spreads our funding across multiple schools and districts, and that's what works for me. So, what doesn't work well is to get individual requests like, hey, we can't afford to hire 5 math teachers because we can't find them, and then if we do, they're like out of our price range because DPS is going to suck them up, or Jeff or somebody else. So we have to look at ways that we can leverage our money, and it's through folks like Kurt and Judy, to say, hey, there are resources amongst you that can spread and help all schools get there. I should give it back to Matt.
We are out of time. We're going to move on. If we could just thank Bruce and Scott real quick. Thank you very much.